as I was preparing for this, I was looking back in what is our approach to reading the Bible from an Episcopal or Anglican background. And that spirit is to never do it alone, to always do
That's
it
good, right?
in community. And I was like, wow, that's exactly what biblical interpretation should be and has always been, I think, in throughout history. The problem that comes is creating that safe space to have those who want to take the text and lift it, like some of my friends call it social justice warriors, and go out, right, and do right now, to those who are not yet ready to go out and do that work, but and haven't engaged. And I think some of that problem is what America suffers with, not just the Episcopal Church, but America, that we have our missals or our prayer books and so forth, and that is enough scripture for us, or hear the preacher, but not truly engage it weekly or daily in community if we can.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get to that point is one of the struggles of our church, I think, today, is a lot of us just wait till Sunday, but don't gather. I mean, of course, the pandemic's bringing a lot into this too. But how do we gather daily or weekly, at least, in community to discuss these? Because we each bring our own voice.
Yes.
White, male, gay, clergy, educated, so forth, bring to the text as each one of us. How do we leave space for that? So just a comment, I guess.
Okay, no problem with the comment at all. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things I will say that I've seen since this since we've been under one form of lockdown or another is that people have been a lot more engaging about Bible study than I've really seen before, and it may. I mean, I have my own ideas about the limits about what trying to do this in this type of Zoom format might be. But one of the things that Zoom has done has been that it's been gotten people to do a lot of more active engaging with matters of scripture or theology, but specifically with scripture and teaching on that. And then I can remember happening really at any other time in parish churches all over. I mean, the parish that I go to, the one that's in back of me in DC, has had just a one thing after another, which has been active Bible study, and doing it not just to be able to talk about historical issues of the Bible, but that have done it in such a way that it's encouraged engagement of people to study scripture in community with others, maybe all over the United States, because of the fact that Zoom makes it possible to do this, where the other voices do get heard, and where those other voices help people to see the broad things that become issues for the church as a whole, and listening to the other voices, not just speaking, but listening to those other voices is the thing that helps to propel that forward. I mean, I like it, quite frankly.
It has been a remarkable moment I think, in the history of the church, that people have been through Zoom engaging in scripture study, engaging in common prayer together over Zoom in ways that they haven't before. And I think it's a real moment where we can talk about spiritual formation and scripture formation and teaching. I think that the Episcopal Church is in a period of change. I think Stephanie Speller's talk the last time we did this certainly brought that out, and I think I see that all over. How do you think that clergy say in the Diocese of Bethlehem, who will be listening to our conversation, what tools can they engage with? How can they help their parishioners engage in this kind of scripture study that is helpful to them?
One of the people who I've had the honor of teaching with was a woman scholar named Barbara Hall. And Barbara taught at Virginia until she retired during the 90s. And one of the things, there were two things that Barbara said that have always stuck with me. One is that she talked about the fact that that those of us who teach Bible spend a fair amount of our time writing and teaching one another, writing to one another, writing for one another, in order to be able to promote our own position within the academy in whatever way you want to talk about what that is. But as she would say, Barbara used to say, but that's not where the action is. So she spent a lot of her time when she worked with her students, empowering students to be able to take what gets done with this concentrated study that people who are parish priests or who are or the like, or who are not parish priests but who are lay people who are doing the academic study of the Bible and things like that, and to make that something which then becomes available to people who are in congregations. So we do our homework, and then and we do it well. We don't cut corners. We do it with the idea that that what we're doing when we're getting ready to work with a congregation is just as important as what we were doing if we were writing something for the Society for Biblical Literature, and that we do it with exactly the same amount of precision, the exact same amount of fervor, and that what gets produced as a result of it is something which people can understand, and then we share it so that other people might be able to be engaged with what we do, and then we listen. Because just as important when I teach, I know, as what I happen to learn from doing my own study is what I learned from listening to people whom I teach. I mean, the people who really teach me are not people who taught me, were not people who were in the graduate school of Yale University, but they were my students. Because they would ask the questions, and they weren't afraid to ask the questions. And they would say, "This does not ring true for me. What can you say?" And then the other thing that Barbara was keen on was something which she called joining the conversation. And it was a way of being able to talk about biblical studies as being a situation in which, and the way that she structured this was that she looked at the progression of words of Jesus that went from Jesus's words to the time of oral transmission, to the time when Gospels themselves were written. And then she says, and the next step is your step. And that step is just as important when it comes to what takes place when people do biblical reading and interpretation, as what, in one sense, Jesus himself had said, because that is the ongoing way in which those words of Jesus move into the next and the next and the next generation. Well, I suppose the same thing could be said by Paul. I can certainly study Philemon and the letter and all, but of equal consequence is what happens when the church itself begins as a community to take this and then use that as an occasion for people to be in conversation with what Paul himself had said. I mean, I'd like to think that one of the things that that I've been able to do in the work that I've done is to finally sit down with Paul and say, okay, Paul, what are you really thinking about? And why does it make any difference for me? Because I'm not living back there. I'm living here. But I live with a canon of scripture which says that these books are ones that I have to accept as being normative for me as part of the Christian community. Okay, how am I going to deal with the fact that in many cases, policing in the United States has taken on the trappings of being something which is completely uncontrolled when it comes to dealing with minority communities. I mean, how do I read Romans 13 and all this stuff about being responsive to the civil powers when the civil powers have some big problems going on? What does Paul have to say to that? And how can I listen and listen in such a way that the powers can be called into question for the times in which they do not act in ways which are legitimate or just? I mean, it's a conversational thing, and it might be good to make sure that there is somebody in that conversation about Romans that's from the police department, and that they're there to be able to put in their own take on what Paul is trying to say and what the limits of legitimate authority should be, and the impact that it might necessarily have on the community in which they're practicing this.
Tony,
so I think there are a lot of possibilities.
Yeah. With that gathering and community and listening, how would our clergy or our lay leaders who may be putting some kind of study together, but are hesitant because they don't come from a particular background to have that kind of conversation? Like, I'm a white male. How do I have a conversation about policing and racial conversations with Philemon? With that, like, how do I equip myself? You said resource ourselves. Do we bring someone else into the conversation, or what?
Yeah. Well, and again, here I'm hazarding a guess that given the fact that we're not all on the exterior cut from exactly the same cloth, that each of us has his or her own place where they can wedge into the story, even if the story is not exactly the same one as the one that another person inside of the congregation has. I mean, it may be that that you are not female, but there may be things within your own experience that may not be exactly congruent with what somebody else who's different on the exterior might be. But nonetheless would be a way of being able to say, yeah, I can identify with that. I may not be able to identify with it in the same way, but here's my experience of something that sounds a heck of a lot like what you're saying. I mean, it's not a question of having a person surrender their identity if the idea is diversity and that the concern really for the church is unity and not uniformity. But there's enough wiggle room really, for a person to be able to say, okay, how can I hear that situation speaking to who I am? It may not be over the same thing, but it may be over something similar. And that place of similarity becomes a thing which puts us both in the same situation, and that is the result of the fact that we all do belong to the same thing if we belong to the church as the church is. Does that make sense? I mean,
yeah. And as you were speaking to that, like, I think about some of the solidarity that Paul has, whether he's good with his words.
Yeah.
And focusing on that child of God, being baptized in Christ, the human dignity is probably somewhere where we can kind of start the conversation.
That sure is a great place to be able to start, and then to be able to say that that this is not an invitation, as was the case of this letter itself, where we've got sort of a cookie cutter picture of the church, where everybody is going to look exactly the same. We've got something that holds us together, We all partake of the same spirit. I mean, there are lots of places we all belong to the same body. I mean, all of these words that of unification that Paul uses really do drive us to acknowledge the commonality of who we are. But at the same time, it celebrates the fact, and this goes back to that metaphor of the body that shows up in 1 Cor 12 and places like that, where where you've got all of these different members operative to be able to give the body not only articulation, but give the body the chance to be able to branch out into places where certain parts of the body can't necessarily go, and that's what it that's the possibility that it opens up and that it makes possible.
Friends, we have a few more minutes together. So if we have an extra question that you'd like to get in there, either Bruce or Sidney or Tony, a final word maybe at the end of it. We've got a few more minutes.
Okay. Well, it struck me in the course of this conversation that when we're talking about Bible study, that we've all taught in classrooms, and we know how important it is to establish that atmosphere of trust with each other, that everyone can speak and know that they will be respected and heard. Mm-hmm. And that is a gradual process. And it, often we're called on to say, well, what does the Bible say about this?
Yeah. A lot of things.
And I think that's, in a sense, our society wants quick answers.
Yep. How
do we respond to that in our teaching, in our preaching, in our parish lives?
If you're asking me that question, I think again, truth in lending. Since the Bible is not a book that is written by one person at one particular time, but rather is the compilation of various writings over a long period of time, reflective of the thoughts of different authors at the time. The answer: does the Bible say one thing about something? Well, other than the fact that there is God, I don't think that you're going to find that there's going to be uniformity in saying what the one answer is going to be. But rather, it's going to say, given what the revelation of God is, how have people over a period of time experienced who God is and what God has to say to situations A, B, C, D, and E. That takes on people's part, I think, a fair amount of courage, and it means that you can that a person should be able to be courageous enough to say that there may not be just one answer, or as in the case of Job, which I spent yesterday plowing through again, the answer that comes may not be the answer that's ultimately closed and satisfied. It may be welcome to the mystery, and then you're going to figure out how you're going to live with the mystery once you realize and accept the mystery as being the reality that you lived in. But then that's always been the case. I mean, it's why the ways that people have gone about doing biblical interpretation have been as varied as they've been over the years. But I like the idea of a guarantee that comes when this is a communal situation, and when the different voices are there, because that in its own way says that there is more than just one solution to whatever the issue is, and that the Scripture is going to invite you into a world in which that more than one solution is not going to be the exception. It's going to be the norm.
Well, thank you so much. I think you've given us all a lot to think about, and and to bring back, I hope, to our parishes and to our own study. And and I guess one final word that I would say is that Scripture, as you have just said, Scripture is vast. And the rabbis said, turn it and turn it and turn it again. And we'll never get the final answer from it. We will continue to find new things. And as Bruce has said, in community, reading in community is so important.
Yeah, that's why I lived for a while in Long Island, and I found out when I went one day to Wall Street that there were groups of Jewish men who would meet for lunch to do midrash, and they would be down there working on scripture. There were people who worked on Wall Street. And they would be spending that time doing that type of intentional study because they believed that by doing that searching, they would find something. And the most important thing for them wasn't the answer. Just like the thing that's true about Midrash itself is that it's not the answer, it's the bunch of questions. And the questions become the things that fuel a person's way of being able to say, how does this say something to where I am right now? And in some ways, this little book inside of the New Testament is an invitation to take that and to do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. And I think that's so important that a lot of my students, they just needed the permission to ask the questions. And I think that's what our congregations need, that it's not just what the big preacher's saying up there or the professors, but we want to hear from you. You can ask the questions to God. And truly we find every day a piece of ourselves, but also a piece of God in that. So.
Yes, yes.